Alrighty, everybody. Today we are going back to Netflix with another crime drama documentary, this one titled The Sons of Sam. The story around the New York killings that happened back in the mid-70s, and some found a deep connection to these murders in a string of satanic cults, Charles Manson, and a journalist named Maury Terry. Forewarning, this episode has some pretty dark themes, but I will not be going over those in any detail. Instead, I am focusing on the documentary itself, and how well Netflix did telling the story in general, so let's get to it because this is Redeye Reviews. Okay, first things first, I really want to emphasize that this story is dark and very disturbing, and I am choosing not to go into any of that detail, as my channel is intended to be more fascinating and entertaining, and I have no intention of going out of my way to bum anybody out or make any of you sad. I will start, however, with that overview of the story itself, and then talk about my own reactions. I will give you a timestamp to skip the overview if you really want, but as I mentioned, I'm not going to go into too much detail, so if you choose to watch the series, I will not at all be ruining that experience for you. So during the mid-1970s, crime and disorder was rampant in New York City. So when someone winds up shot and dead in their car, it doesn't seem too out of place. However, when it happens a few months later, and then again, people start to become nervous, and they start to see patterns. For instance, almost all of the victims are women, and they all have a certain color hair at a certain length. So everyone is starting to hide. People are getting their hair cut or hiding their heads or not going out in public at all at night. On one of these victims, a letter is found from the killer, talking about him being the son of Sam and killing in his name, claiming he is a monster and Sam hurts us and he makes us kill. So people believe that he might be a Vietnam vet, maybe talking about Uncle Sam or something like that. A journalist named Jimmy Breslin puts an article out as a message to the killer, and in return receives a letter from the son of Sam, with even more angry and weird ties to the devil and random nicknames, claiming a dog named Sam tells him who to kill, and just a lot of crazy stuff. And every newspaper in New York wants to be a part of this story, because it's really all anybody is talking about. But there's still no suspect. Several sketches, but no suspect. On the 1-year anniversary of the first murder, the police are out in record numbers trying to keep people safe, and nothing happens. However, the next day, 2 people are shot. One of them dies, the other one does survive, but they do believe it to be the same guy because the bullets that were used in all of these murders was a .44 caliber bullet, donning him this name, the .44 caliber killer. And now the entire city wants this person caught and punished. Everyone is getting in everybody else's business, and the police are investigating into anybody with a record, and enough small pieces of evidence points at this guy named David Berkowitz. So the police break into his car, and they find a Son of Sam letter and a gun. So they hide out, they arrest this guy. He immediately claims to be the Son of Sam. You've got me, you found me, I'm guilty. They take him in and quickly process him, and then they ship him off to a psych ward to be evaluated to see if he is mentally fit enough to stand trial. During this time, he claims that Sam is a 6,000-year-old being that talks through his neighbor's dog and tells him who to kill, and his neighbor's dog is owned by a guy named Sam. Everybody thinks he's obviously a nut, but regardless, they all celebrate that this nightmare is finally over. The police all pat each other on the back, the mayor announces he's running for re-election. It's a really big win for the city that really needed some good news. But then this journalist who works for IBM of all companies, named Maury Terry, feels that something just isn't right. He felt like some of the pictures from the eyewitnesses are just too different from one another, and it feels like maybe there's more than one person involved, and Berkowitz doesn't even match the most recent sketch. And above everything else, he isn't technically the son of Sam. He is Sam's neighbor who just walks his dog. So he gets the phone book out, and he finds a guy named John Wheat's car, who Maury draws a connection in one of the Sons of Sam letters that mentions a John Wheaties, and this John was actually the son of the man named Sam who owned the dog. So it makes way more sense than someone named Berkowitz. However, by this case, the police had closed the case already, and they made Berkowitz the lone gunman. And the NYPD had every intention to keep this case closed because they did a lot of things wrong. They searched his car without a search warrant, so that might not even hold up in court. They never even interviewed the Carr family. They never interviewed John Carr, the actual son of Sam. They were just so busy patting themselves on the back. And yeah, why would they want to reopen a case that could show that they were wrong? They would look worse than they already do. So it's in their best interest to just shut down any and all theories that contradict what they've already said. So Maury takes it upon himself then to investigate further. and he learns that John Carr and his brother Michael, as well as Berkowitz, would all hang out in this old abandoned park. When he investigates his park, he finds a lot of rather messed up evidence that supports that there were maybe some satanic rituals that took place in the park. And now he thinks the murders maybe are tied to the occult. So he goes headfirst into researching that world, and he learns that their particular group would call themselves the Children. And in the letter from the killer, he does mention things like Beelzebub and imps, and this symbol that kind of relates back to ancient Satan worshippers. So this theory does hold a bit of water. However, before he has a chance to try and interview Berkowitz, the New York Times released an article named Berkowitz Sleeps, and it literally is just a picture of him sleeping in the psych ward. They were so desperate to draw any attention back to them in this story, but it made everyone pissed, because technically nobody was allowed to access him, let alone take photos of him. And somebody clearly did, because the newspaper got a hold of it. So now his security at the hospital is crazy tight, and it made it impossible for Maury to get anywhere close enough to interview the guy. So the story goes cold for a little while, until somebody informs him that they found John Carr dead up in North Dakota. Not knowing why the hell he would even be in that state, Maury goes to check it out, and the local police inform him that John Carr was leading a bunch of sick, twisted cult rituals with a handful of people out there. And not only that, but Berkowitz would come and visit him every so often as well. However, during a routine check on the Air Force Base, an officer knocked on John Carr's apartment's door, and as soon as they even introduced themselves, he took his own life. So that trail kind of goes cold there. So our investigator goes back to New York City and learns that the other Carr son, Michael, has been found dead. Ran off the road by somebody and dies in a car crash. We dig deeper into Michael's background and we find that he had ties with an even bigger cult that has ties all over the country and even has ties to people like Charles Manson and the family cult. And again, I'm not going to get into any of that cult detail because it's really twisted and it's not exactly the lighthearted style my channel typically has, so I'm going to spare you all that detail. What is important to note is that during this time, while Berkowitz wasn't talking to the media, he was still talking to an inmate of his, and that inmate sent a letter out that eventually made its way to Maury. It mentions a big-time millionaire in the Hamptons that was a part of the cult's twisted plot, and he has the initials RR. A few sleuths draw the connection to a producer, Roy Radin, who at the time was known for throwing really big orgy parties and drug parties and was also under allegations of misconduct, so he kind of fit the bill. But right as we're gaining traction, he's found dead, murdered in the middle of nowhere. So Maury goes out to LA, and the LAPD believe his story enough that they tell him where Radin was killed. And while snooping around that area, he finds a Bible by a tree, and he draws evidence back to the cult, and now he feels like he has absolutely everything to tell his entire story. That all of his evidence leads back to Roy Radin as some sort of kingpin cult leader who's pulling the strings and making people act out and do crazy stuff and killing people. So Maury sits down and he writes a book called The Ultimate Evil, where he drops his entire theory into the murders and its tie back to the occult, and the media ate it up. It sold like crazy, and it went on a ton of TV shows, and he talks about it. This is during that time where everybody thought their teenager was getting involved with demon worship, and they hated Dungeons and Dragons and the Smurfs. But with all of this, Maury Terry becomes more reputable and seems to know what he's talking about. However, just a couple short years go by, and the investigators into Roy Radin's murder actually conclude that he was killed by people that he blacklisted from Hollywood, and they just killed him to exact revenge for kicking him out of one of the movies. So now that Maury's cult leader figure was found out to not really be that, people just started questioning the entire story. Were the killings really even tied to the occult? Is Maury just a conspiracy nut? So on and so forth. And so Maury Terry spends years basically fighting for his story and just trying to convince people again that he has really stumbled onto a massive countrywide cult cover-up, and he's not just a nut. So we cut now all the way to 1993, and out of the blue, a guard who knows Berkowitz reaches out to Maury and says that he has seen the light, and Berkowitz is now a Christian and would be absolutely willing to talk about his story. So for the first time, Maury will meet the man that he is obsessed with in person. And while Terry makes a good investigator, he is not a great interviewer, because he never really pushes Berkowitz hard on any details. He gives really softball questions. He does, however, get him to admit that he wasn't the only gunman, and that there were others involved, including the Carr brothers, which up until this point, he has taken credit for every killing. So that was actually a pretty big thing. So the Inside Edition goes public with this interview, and the NYPD still says it's all lies. It's clear that Maury is a conspiracy nut, And Berkowitz is just a deranged killer, just giving Murray whatever he wants to hear. So even after all of this, the police still insist he was the lone gunman. And this drove Murray insane. And the story consumes him. He was so deep into his own narrative that he just refused to see any other possibilities. So he starts jumping to conclusions to fit his theory, saying that, well, if A and B knew each other, then clearly C and D knew each other. And this story takes a huge toll on his health. He becomes a 2-pack-a-day smoker, a heavy drinker. He isolates himself from pretty much everybody he knows. Whoever even remotely disagrees with his narrative, he would shun from his life. And the stress of his own search for an answer, and, who knows what ultimately that answer would have even been, if it even would have satisfied him, leads his own health to decline rapidly. And even on his deathbed, this guy was asking his friend to call an attorney that was a part of the trial to find out about some evidence. His last breaths were still his obsession about this story, and it took over his life. It consumed him for more than 40 years, him just trying to convince people of his theory that the occult were responsible for not only the New York murders, but several murders across the country. It was his white whale, and it ultimately killed him. And that's basically where the story ends. I left out a ton of detail because this documentary is dark. Honestly, I think it might be one of the darkest crime documentaries Netflix has done to date. Don't get me wrong, I think they did a very good job with it, but it's really, really heavy stuff. It was packed full of info, unlike some of the other documentaries where there's clearly some filler episode in the middle because the story might not have enough detail. This one fills all 4 episodes with a ton of story. However, it kind of feels like one of those documentaries about whaling or a natural disaster where you don't feel good for watching it, you just kind of feel more informed. That's how I feel about this one. What I found fascinating was that the series starts looking into the murders, moves towards a huge cult operation and Satan worshippers, but then is ultimately really about a story of a journalist who was so obsessed with uncovering his answer, he dedicated his life to it and it physically destroyed him. And I personally think a person like that wouldn't really have been satisfied with the truth anyways. They've created such a detailed and extravagant narrative in their mind that if somebody presented them the actual truth, he probably still wouldn't have accepted it. Which it's sad, but you can see that story told time and time again. Like with the vanishing at the Cecil Hotel, and you can feel free to check out my video on that documentary, there were so many people that created this wild story of what they thought had happened that when the truth came out, they just couldn't believe it. They overlooked the most obvious answers and tried to make their grand conspiracy come true. And I mean, who knows what the truth here really is? There could be a huge cover-up, sure. There could be a massive cult. I tend to take the approach that the truth is probably comprised of a little bit of each. It lies somewhere in the middle between what we're told and what we think happened. But that's neither here nor there, because I really don't care to go too much further into the detail on this one. If you like crime dramas and you don't have a weak stomach, this is a pretty good watch. It's definitely something I personally don't plan on ever watching again, and I'm probably fine with forgetting about it entirely, but give it one watch if that's your jam. As with all my other documentaries, I'm not going to rate it. It's based on real life, and I just think that's a really terrible thing to do. However, let's end on a happy note. My next video will be out on Saturday, and it is about a ridiculous movie called American Ninja, and it's terrible. The video's great, movie's terrible, but I love it. So thank you so much for watching this video. Please make sure to subscribe, like the video, hit the bell, tell me what you thought. If you've seen this, if you heard the story, I personally am a bit too young to have been wrapped up in this story when it came out. So this was the first time I had even heard about it. But fascinating stuff. We will see you in the next one, and until then, stay happy and stay healthy.